And every lawyer that I've proposed it to says I'm crazy. And they're like, why would you ever cut your bill or rate? Like, why? And then I met with a really close friend and colleague of mine. She's at one of the top AM law firms. She looked at me and kind of gave me this look. And I was like, be honest with me, what's that look like? I hate to say it, but I think you're right. This is where it's going. I just think you're getting out in front of it. So that was great validation to have, that this is really, and ultimately the purpose behind this is to provide better legal services to my clients and open up doors to businesses that may have been priced out of certain things in the past.
Hey everyone, welcome back to Reanimated Stories. I am Roger Jones. I'm your host of Reanimation Design, and today I am with Michael. And Michael has got a really cool business and it's going to be very unique. And as far as I know, he's really the only one that does it like this. So it'd be really interesting to see how he does this and to learn a little bit more about him. And I think that you will find this extremely interesting. Michael, how are you doing today?
Great, Roger. Thanks for having me today.
Yeah, no, not a problem. It was great meeting you. Michael is down here in Austin. I don't want to take too much away from him, but he's down here in Austin and we met through a fractional event and it was just really awesome just hearing what you're doing. And I said, I'm not necessarily in that space, but I thought that was really cool. So without further ado, Michael, tell us about yourself and what you do.
Yeah, so my background is I'm a corporate tax attorney by trade, and so I've spent the past uh 13 or so years working with companies of all sizes. And really what my focus has always been on is how do we establish businesses, set them up, get them capitalized? How do we make them operate and grow intelligently in a tax efficient manner, and to prep them for what, every business owner hopes is an eventual acquisition. So to get them ready for that event has been kind of what I've focused most of my practice on. And I've spent the past couple of years being the chief legal officer for a growth-based company. And that was, when we get more into my business model, that was like the last piece of the puzzle that I needed before I really figured out how to implement this in practice, because the outsourced general counsel model has been something that has been, kind of in the works for the past decade or so. And I finally kind of figured out, well, how do you actually implement it in practice? And I feel like I can use that as a segue. We can jump right in to tell you a little bit more about the business model itself.
Yeah, no, definitely. I think that that's really awesome. When you had first told me about it, obviously not necessarily, again, like I mentioned at the beginning, not necessarily being in that space, but once you had explained it to me, I was like, oh yeah, no, that totally makes sense. So tell us a little bit about what you do and kind of the model that you've started to really bring about.
Yeah, I think a good starting point is the problem. And the main problem is, and they publish these reports every year, but the median hourly billable rate for the top 100 law firms in the country is now over $1,000 an hour. There was a about 10% increase for 2024, and they did an additional just over 8% increase on top of that into 2025. So they publish a report at the end of every year, and you see what is kind of the larger outfits, how are they pricing their legal services. And it the growth of law firms and the increase in the billable hourly rate is not necessarily indicative of natural economic conditions. So the net effect of that is, and I noticed that being the chief legal officer of a company, and we worked with an AmLaw 100 firm, and receive an invoice for a couple $1,000s for a meeting. And so the net effect of that is you have, kind of, we'll say your smaller businesses and startups, maybe doing like 0 to 50 or 0 to 5 million in annual revenue. They have been completely priced out of that market. And so what does that mean for small business owners? Well, there's not going to be the same level of service that they're necessarily going to be able to find outside of those big 100 law firms. My background specifically as a tax attorney, a lot of my colleagues are I think most of my colleagues are probably at these AmLaw 100 firms. So they're not getting any access to an entire practice area that, in my opinion, and it's a little self-serving, is critical to the growth of businesses. And I've always taken the approach that my services should be available to everybody. Every business owner, whether they're do a startup or they're doing 100 million in annual revenue, would benefit from working with someone like me. And so you have that segment that has been completely priced out. And then you have kind of your larger small businesses and your middle market companies, so probably doing like 5 to 50 million in annual revenue. Those are probably the organizations that are leaning most heavily on these firms that are billing north of $1,000 an hour. So this now the model that I've implemented has mitigated, if not eliminated, the need for reliance on these larger law firms. And then everything above that, 50 million plus in annual revenue, they probably have a dedicated general counsel. They probably have an in-house legal team, but they may not have like tax attorneys, or we have data privacy attorneys, or specifically like healthcare transactions. So they may still be relying on their outside retained counsel for these areas that they don't have in-house. And so what our model is that it is a subscription based fractional general counsel model where the client engages with our firm and we embed a legal officer general counsel on their team. And it can either be project based or time based. And so the model really does reward clients for commitment. And we offer everything from 3 months to a year long commitment, and it's graduated. So the more commitment that the clients that they sign on for, the lower the net hourly rate is. We don't, I only propose it in hourly rates just because it's something that clients are familiar with seeing, but it's flat fee based. So when you sign up, you will see I pay this amount every month for 3 months, and this is the hours that I get. This is what rolls over, and so that's kind of the meat and potatoes of the firm is doing the outsourced general counsel. And another thing too is, and I've actually done the market research. I've gone out and talked to chief legal officers and general counsels of high-growth companies, and they're all former AmLaw, big law firm attorneys, and they know that, that was the biggest topic. I went to two events recently. The biggest topic was the increase in retained counsel's rate, and they know that a lot of what goes into that figure is you are paying for the training of junior lawyers. And we don't, at least currently, we don't work with any attorneys that are licensed. Most of us are licensed north of 10 years. And if not, we have one attorney that has been licensed, I believe, 60 years, but she came from the biggest law firm in the world. So, her 6 years of experience kind of, you know, supplements for the years that some of the other people may have. So it's a more efficient way for companies to engage and consume legal services. And in my opinion, I believe that this is the future of how legal services are going to be consumed, and especially with law firms implementing the use of AI in their practices. Because my understanding, for everything that I've read and trends that I've noticed just in how law firms operate, is it's not going to replace lawyers. Maybe someday down the road, but at least initially, I don't think we're there yet. It's but it's definitely going to change how law firms staff projects, because a lot of what legal assistants or paralegals or even junior lawyers, what they were doing before, and now at least 70% of it can be handled through a robust AI infrastructure. And so that's something that we're focusing on. And that's how we kind of justify our model and our rate, is that we're lowering overhead and not, pawning off our overhead expenses on the client.
Yeah. No, that's really interesting. And I think that that's really cool because, a lot of times, well, just like you said, I mean, that's crazy. The first thing that I heard is that I'm obviously in the wrong business because I need to start making 1,000 an hour for a retainer. That is fantastic. But that is, yeah, that's outrageous. Just thinking about that, right? I mean, you're thinking like, okay, well, I have this guy here for 5 hours, right? And they may not have necessarily done anything, but just for that, it's like, dude, that cost me 5,000, and then now you're having to wait and do all that. And now they're having to go back and they're having to check everything. And so man, that is crazy. You had mentioned so there's a couple things I want to hit on, but you had mentioned, having this idea of, okay, well, we're kind of these fractional, we're these project based, we're hourly, but we're project based, and it could be anywhere from 3 months to about a year. And I think when people hear that, it's like, oh, that does make sense. It is, but I mean, it's not, but it sounds like, oh, you're like a lawyer for hire, but it's like, well, you're staying with them long term. Is that correct? Like it's not just like, I mean, yes, it could be, hey, we need you for this situation, this thing, we're changing, we're doing this or something like that. But you're really looking for them to be kind of like a long term there, that for, they can't afford to, hire like an in-person team, but now you're coming in and you're stepping in and saying, hey, we'll do this on a project base and we'll be here for 3, 6, 7 months or something like that.
Yeah, and that, a couple things, result from that, especially with like larger operational businesses. They already have a budget allocated.
Mm.
So one of two scenarios is going to play out. Either they're going to save on overhead because they're no longer leaning so much on the big law firms, or they're going to get more services because, just for math sake, let's say they have $500,000 a year allocated to outside legal, and that money is already spoken for. It's already allocated, but now they're going to get a lot more. And this has always been my approach ever since I was a green lawyer myself, was establishing the relationship. I think that's one of the most important parts. And for me, I'm a better practitioner when I learn about the business itself and the decision makers and the culture, and that allows me to be a more effective attorney. And even before, when I was an associate working at a law firm, I would go on site to my clients just to see, because like hearing it in a meeting is one thing, but actually seeing, I had a client that was like a manufacturing. They manufactured like the bag just that go to like all the fast food restaurants, and I just
Yeah.
couldn't understand it. I had to go in there and see it. I'm a very visual person, but that taught me at a very young age that the relationship is really the important part. So you'll have, like a client doing like a private offering, doing a capital raise, seeking investments from outside sources, and they may sign up for like the 6-month program. And the idea is to use that as a springboard to something more permanent, but they may not need it after that point. And so it gets them through that kind of project base. But then most of my former clients that I worked with on a monthly basis, year in and year out, some of them, I've been working with one client since I got out into private practice, and they've been with me this entire time. And yeah, and so that's more they see it as, well, we're gonna work with you, all year anyways. So we might as well just commit to it and it make a beneficial relationship for everyone.
Yeah, no, I think that's fantastic. And I think you hit on such a crucial part, is that relationship. Now, I've never really had the privilege or need necessarily for a lawyer, but I would, when you think of business, right, there's a difference between just, okay, I'm hiring this person to do this thing versus like, I know Michael or I know Roger or I know Sam or Margaret, right, whatever, and I know that person, and so I'm going to do business with them. And I think that that's such a crucial thing that I think sometimes we forget, in business, and especially, man, especially for something, super important. And I'm not saying, right, like other things aren't important, but I mean, but for like a legal matter like that, you want to have someone that's going to have your back, right? That's looking at it, that knows you, but also knows the law. And I think that's such a crucial thing for them to have, because I can't imagine necessarily, I mean, and I could be wrong again, right? But I can't imagine, just hiring somebody and I'm going to pay you 1,000, an hour without really wanting to know them. And I think that that's such a big thing, having that model for you, because I mean, even with my clients, right? It's like, I want to have that personal relationship with them. And obviously, there's always got to be boundaries and different things, but it's that idea of know, like, and trust. And I think that that's really important. You had mentioned AI. And so, man, there's like so many ways that you can go with that. But how do you see? So I guess quickly, how do you see AI changing, and what are well, yeah, how do you see AI changing it? And then I'll ask you my second question in just a moment. So quickly tell me, how do you see AI kind of changing that legal landscape there?
Well, we've already seen. I think it was the chairman of Paul Weiss, which is one of the biggest law firms in the world. There's kind of one on record that said, we're fully planning on implementing AI into our model, and suspect that it's going to, what I said earlier, minimize the need for some support staff and junior attorneys. I think where this is ultimately going to go, at least where technology is today, you still need to have an experienced set of eyes. I'm sure everybody that's watching this has pinpointed where AI hallucinates on something. I've sat there and argued with ChatGPT about something I know. I know what the law said. So I think you're always going to have that need for an experienced set of eyes. And so if I had to predict, I would say the legal field is probably going to shift more towards like an apprenticeship style, where
Yeah.
law firms are not going to hire associates at the same level, but people are going to essentially work as apprentice or a journeyman underneath an experienced lawyer for a few years so they can get the experience they need to go out and then do it on their own.
Yeah, no, that totally makes sense. I know sometimes when I'm doing something with like web design, right? So there's not to bore anybody, but there's like schema, right, markup, and all that sort of stuff. So when it's back end stuff, just like you said, I'll be like, hey, this is what I need for this, and it'll give it to me, and I'm like, that's not right. And I said this needs to be corrected, and it's like, oh, I'm sorry, let me do this, and then it does it again, and I'm like, that's still not right. And
Yeah,
it's like, no, this is the correct thing. And I said, nope. And I'll give it the thing. And then it says, oh, you are correct. I'm sorry. I was looking at it, and I'm like, all right, come on now.
yeah, and so like I said, this is something that has been kind of percolating for the past better part of 10 years. I actually got the idea. A lot of my ideas come from accounting firms. Actually, they always seem to be a good analog, but they're always a little bit more modern than law firms. But I got the idea. I was walking around the Riverwalk, San Antonio, and I met this guy and we grabbed coffee. We're just talking, and he said, "Yeah, I work for a a fractional CFO group." And I immediately thought, I was like, "Oh, that's brilliant." I wonder how do you do that on the law firm side? Because like really, technically, all of us are all lawyers. That's what it is. They're fractionals. You hiring them on a project basis, but fast forward, I've been pitching this idea or doing kind of like market research and seeing does this have any legs? Is this going to go
Mm.
somewhere? And every lawyer that I've proposed it to says I'm crazy. And they're like, why would you ever cut your bill or rate? Like, why? And then I met with a really close friend and colleague of mine, and she's at one of the top AM law firms. And she looked at me and kind of gave me this look, and I was like, be honest with me, what's that look like? I hate to say it, but I think you're right. This is where it's going. I think you're getting out in front of it. So that was great validation to have that this is really, and ultimately the purpose behind this is to provide better legal services to my clients, and open up doors to businesses that may have been priced out of certain things in the past.
One of the things that I wanted we were talking about AI. What are some of the pitfalls that we want to that one needs to avoid when they're thinking, right? Because sometimes it's easy to be like, hey, give me this advice, and like you said, sometimes they treat the AI like a fractional, legal person, but like you had mentioned earlier, you need to still have eyes on that. You need to have a human look at that, and you've been thinking about this idea, and it's like, well, people may already be kind of using AI in this fractional legal sense. And it's like, but you need that person. So what are some pitfalls? What are some things that people really need to avoid and really think through when using AI for any sort of legal matter?
Yeah, I mean, I just caution against leaning on it too heavily, because it goes the same thing with junior lawyers. Like, you don't know what you don't know, and we've seen, and there are ways around this, but generally, when you log in to whatever AI platform you're using, there's a bias, you know, to tell you that you have great ideas
Yeah.
and that you're right and everything. So it's being able to issue spot and identify and to be able to push back on AI and and get the answer that you need. Because I used AI as a good way to keep me on track with projects. It's mostly stuff that I already know, but it's like, I'm doing this M&A transaction, put together a checklist for me just to keep me on track, because it's a lot to manage, especially being lead counsel, because I have to oversee everything. And I always get the horror stories. It's similar. It's like an analog to the self help legal services. I have like clients come in all the time and say, "Well, I formed my own LLC and all this stuff like that," and it's like, "Well, you did it wrong. like I'm gonna fix it now, but it costs more for me to do cleanup work than it does for me to do things right up front." So, there are certain things in my line of work that if it's not done right up front, it can be extremely costly. A good example is, what choice of entity should I use in my business venture? You know, you'll talk to your colleagues and they say, "Oh, set up an LLC." But there are a ton of other reasons why you may want to set up as a corporation. And if you get too far down the road operating as an LLC, it's not impossible, but it's going to cost you. And, there could be tax consequences to converting over to a C corporation. So, my kind of caution would be, just don't rely on it too much, because it doesn't supplement for, for true legal counsel, because again, you don't know if AI is just telling you what it thinks you want to hear, and not
Yeah,
necessarily what you should do or defend.
yeah, 100%. And you mentioned, and even if it's like up to date, because it may not always be dragging everything. Because I remember one time I had asked it a question about something, and it was like, oh yeah, it's this. I can't remember. It was something about like asking it for me to give me some code for something, and it gave me like this, and I said, wait, what are you talking about? And it was like, oh well, yeah, this. And I said, no, I'm reading. It says this, and it's like I want you to give me that, and then it kind of like lost its mind for a second, and it was like, I'm sorry, I don't recognize that. So yeah, 100%. And that's also very interesting too, because I think that that's really important for business owners to really think through, okay, LLC, corporation, in like you had mentioned, there's always going to be a bias from the AI, and I think it's extremely important to have it be something that is kicking back to you, and not just like, oh, I'm just going to agree with everything you say and you're just this unicorn, and all this sort of stuff. So I think that's really smart. If someone
Yeah,
was thinking, oh, I'm sorry, go ahead. What were we going to say, Michael?
no, I was gonna say, like, a good example is, AI is only as good as the human element, the input, and if the input is lacking or is not thorough enough, then AI, it's going to give you the right answer, but it's not going to give you the thorough answer that maybe you're looking for. Great example of that is when you're deciding to set up your business. If you don't if you don't tell it, I plan on growing this business and selling it in 10 years, what is the best model for that, then you don't get to take advantage of something like the qualified small business stock exception or exemption from, the sale of corporate shares, because you set up as an, then so that's kind of it'll tell you good information, but it may not get you 100% of the way there. And then you don't find out until down the road. Maybe you have a letter of intent, someone wants to acquire your business, and then you call me, and you know that ship has sailed. So,
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Because it does, and that's and that's such a great point. It's not conversing. Like we say, oh, it's conversational AI, but at the same time, if you're not asking it and you're not saying, hey, ask me these questions, like think through, like, what are some questions? What am I missing? Whereas a human is going to know that, a lawyer is going to know that, and I think that that's really smart advice. So if someone was thinking, hey, I might be kind of interested, or I don't know if I need, legal counsel. I don't know if I need like a fractional, if I don't know if like what Michael is doing, or just I'm looking for legal advice. What are some of the things that they need to think through to be ready to either converse with you or to find legal advice? What are some of the things that they need to think through, and what are some of the areas that they need to think through as well?
yeah, obviously, budget's a huge consideration for when do you engage with a lawyer, and that's kind of what I've built my model around, again, to open up doors, because best case scenario is you call an attorney, and I have clients that are like this, and they just, every time a contract gets put in front of them, they send it to me and say, just review it and let us know, like, what are we signing? And that's a good example of, if you can afford it, it'll really help you, because you never know that it's a problem until it's a problem, and there's like a lawsuit. And you agreed that all lawsuits would be handled in Illinois. You didn't think about it because you didn't review the contract and read all the fine print. If you're thinking about setting up a business, obviously you want to have both, a competent attorney and a good accountant preferably, ones that can work together. If you're in growth mode, so you're thinking about soliciting investments from outside groups, that's a good time to engage with an attorney. If you're in a high growth business, you're gonna see all these contracts are getting thrown at you, and we want to do this. How do we open up a new division, and how do we expand? That's a great time. Obviously, if you're thinking about doing any kind of reorganization, and this is actually, especially in Texas, very common, is I get a lot of California companies that they're moving, like the owners are all moving to Texas for a myriad of reasons, but they're like, how do we get our California corporation into Texas and not trigger tax? They're, that's a great example. If you have any kind of, usually I'll come in after a letter of intent has been signed, but if someone is thinking about buying your business, or if you are going to acquire other businesses, that's a great time to engage with someone like me. Or if you're just noticing you're paying too much tax, or you think you're paying too much tax, a lot of what I'll do is I'll go through company financials, and if nothing else, to be able to explain, well, this is why your effective tax rate is where it's at. Here are some things that we can do. We can invest in this. Let's sell this asset, and we can defer tax on that. And there's all these kind of ways to get creative with how to use the tax code to your benefit. And so it's kind of a sliding scale, and really it goes back to budget. And in company like larger companies, a good example is, especially on the tax side, you'll see a lot of the oil companies. A lot of my colleagues are in-house. A lot of my tax colleagues are in-house at big oil companies. So they see the inherent value in having tax attorneys on staff, because there's so much moving of assets and transactions and everything like that. So, and acquisitions and stuff like that. So, really, whenever anything kind of comes up that has any hint of legal ramifications, like I said, it could be as simple as just, we want to sign a contract. Just let us know what it means. So that way we can make decisions. Just give us the information we need to make an informed decision on whether or not this is a good relationship for us to enter into, all the way through scale your business.
That's excellent. Yeah, no, I think that that's fantastic. Um, Michael, where can people connect with you? And yeah, where can people connect with you?
LinkedIn. We're currently revamping the website, so that'll be forthcoming.
Okay.
And so LinkedIn's a great place. Email direct. I'm very easy to get a hold of. This has always been my approach, is I make myself accessible to people that want to work with me, both in my network professionally, but also clients. So you can call me, you can text me, you can email me. I really enjoy what I do, and I really like helping people out. And sometimes that means having to answer your phone on a Saturday because something came up, and being able to come in and help is, I find personal enjoyment in being able to be there for people in that way.
Well, Michael, I really appreciate you being on the podcast and just letting us know about your business and about what you're doing, about building relationships and helping people really kind of have that legal counsel so that they can be better prepared for whatever comes next, like you said. So thank you so much for coming out today, Michael. I appreciate it.
Thank you for having me, Roger. Have a great weekend too.